Andy Edwards. Never heard of him.
On this video, I'm going to be talking about the British jazz scene. Yes, that pit of elitism and self-loathing gets its own little video. Am I going to be talking about the early trad bands, Infra Littleton, Chris Barber from the 1940s that really lay the groundworks for skiffle and roll and rock music? No, I'm not. I'm going to be talking about the incredible players that came out in the 1950s and 1960s in this country. People like monster musicians like Joe Harriott or Tubby Hayes that were like, should be spoken of in the same breath as a Sonny Rollins or John Coltrane. No, I'm not. What about some of the fusion experiments like bands like Backdoor and the sort of prog stroke jazz rock that existed in the 1970s, you know? And the great guitarists that came that, people like Brian Godding, you know, and Ollie Halsall, or these sort of fusion that existed. No, I'm not. I'm going to be talking about what was perhaps the most successful and culturally, the cultural landmark that was British jazz in the 1980s.
I could listen to them all afternoon.
And so we shall.
I started off as a heavy metal fan in 1980, listening to Diamond Head and Angel Witch and things like that. Then I got into progressive rock. Then I got into jazz rock fusion, and then I started to move towards jazz. Now, I was growing up in the United Kingdom. By the time we got to the mid-80s, 86 say, I'd left school and I was just started attending art college, Bourneville College of Art up in Birmingham. I started there in 1986, and at the same time, suddenly the television was covering this British jazz musician, right? He was incredible. Who was this? Courtney Pine. Courtney Pine was like the British Wynton Marsalis, except where Wynton was sort of exploring some version of hard bop, you know, shot through a sort of little bit of a conservative revisionist mindset. Courtney wasn't like that. Courtney had come out of reggae bands, right? And he was exploring sort of Coltrane, modal jazz, and they were flying. This band was incredible. And not only were they incredible, I could go and see them. I got a tape of the first Courtney Pine album in 1986. And at this point, I was driving up to college every day from my town up to Bourneville College. It was about a 3/4 hour drive. And on cassette, I would play on the way up Van Halen, Shut Up and Play Guitar by Frank Zappa, and the first Courtney Pine album. The Courtney Pine album flew. It was incredible. And behind it was a drummer that was pulling together all the influences that I loved. It wasn't like Jeff Tay Watts, who was great, but was like a virtuoso, you know, composite of Jack DeJohnette and Tony Williams and Philly Joe Jones. Mark Mondesi, I could tell he'd been listening to Billy Cobham, he'd been listening to Narada Michael Walden. He was doing that, but way past what anyone was doing. I've got to be honest, I was pulled into this. Courtney was incredible. You know, bringing these incredibly virtuoso, long modal lines out of the music whilst, you know, Mark Mondesi broke the time up in the background in a way that was revolutionary. We had our own players here, that they were going beyond what the Americans were doing. In that band, you also had Julian Joseph and Gary Crosby. You know, going to be very important musicians in the history of British jazz. But for me, it was Courtney and Mark Mondesi. And I could go and see them play. And I did. I went up to Birmingham, 87-ish, got to see Mark Mondesi playing live. It changed me. I became a huge fan. I started following Mark Mondesi around. He had his own group that was like the Mahavishnu Orchestra. He was playing with Julian Joseph, and I would be at the gigs. Sometimes there'd only be 30 people in there, but I was there watching it. I was soaking up everything that Mark was doing. I no longer have the first album, but when the second Courtney Pine album came out, I got it. Now I've got 5 albums to sort of guide me through this first attempt to talk about this little explosion of jazz that we had here in the UK in the 1980s, because that's still being felt now, right? The outcome of it is still being felt, and I want to get into that and what it represents. I still have the second album, bought when it came out in 1998. Of course, by this time the band had been together for a while. Mark was still in the band, and he was just killing it at this point. Beyond the Thought of My Last Reckoning, unbelievable. In Pursuance, unbelievable. The Vision, incredible. This was on fire, absolutely on fire. We even got a jazz standard on here. We got the 3-minute 22 around midnight. You know, Sacrifice on side 2 was just burning. Here we got Courtney Pine, Paul Hunt on double bass, Julia Joseph on piano, and Mark Mondesi on drums. Absolutely incredible stuff. After this point, Courtney was now at this point household name. He was having singles in the charts. He was turning up on Wogan. You know, he was the man of the moment. Courtney Pine created a market for jazz, and the major labels came in. And they start signing up everybody. They televised the sort of some competition for the most important British jazz musician around this time. And I can remember watching it. The Itchy Fingers won. The judge was Joe Zawinul, I remember that. Itchy Fingers won, featuring a very young Martin Speake, who now has been cast out of the world of British jazz, hasn't he, for his beliefs, and is now coming up here every now and then to jam up with me. And he's perhaps one of the greatest musicians I've ever played with. So it's interesting that what I was seeing there as a young man has come and reached me, and it's reached me in more ways than I thought it would. Because the residual waves of this explosion that happened, this mainstream acceptance of jazz and heavyweight jazz. You know, when Courtney Pine appeared on Wogan and did Children of the Ghetto, it was a nice soul song, but when they got to the solo, he took off. And I'm sat there, it's mainstream BBC One, family entertainment, and now I'm hearing Coltrane coming out of the TV. It's incredible. The label signed them up. On that competition for the best jazz musician that Itchy Fingers won. Itchy Fingers were rewarded with a major label contract. Those guys were on a major label, as was Andy Shepherd, that came out and did another sort of circular breathing virtuoso display. Tommy Smith emerged up in Scotland, right? And we start to see these things coalesce into the British jazz scene. You had the second wave of people signed up, people like Orphy Robinson, Cleveland Watkins. They were also getting on the television the whole time. Steve Williamson, whole bunch of people. And they weren't playing the game like the conservative Wynton Marsalis lot were. Steve Williamson got into that whole M-bass, like Greg Osby, Steve Coleman thing. It was incredible. Right, and I've got all these albums. But here we have it, 1988. This is when it's at its peak. Courtney Pine, Destiny's Song and the Image of Pursuance on Island Records. That was at its peak. Out of this album developed two sort of large ensembles. Now, it was interesting because in the early 90s, I got asked to play in a tribute to Gil Evans. It was a group called Svengali. It featured a lot of musicians around the Birmingham area. I got the gig, and then one of the guys behind my, that was playing in the band, a guy called Stevie Sheriff, he went sort of up to the guys' powers that be and said, "Don't get Andy, he's not very good." I found out about this, I was very upset. It was my first and not my last time I would butt up against the British jazz scene that would reject me over and over again. I could play, I had a ton of chops. The kid that got the gig with Svengali was my student, and yet I wasn't able to cut it for the British jazz scene. I was doing something they didn't like. I got asked to play on one of the sort of jam sessions that was going on in Birmingham in the house band. I got sacked. I heard through the grapevine that the guitarist has said, "We don't want Andy playing like that. I just want somebody keeping time behind me so I could just solo through the standards." There was an elitism there. I started to pick up on it straight away. And what was interesting, that the elitism started to focus itself around two groups. These were both big bands, and like I say, Svengali, people like Mike Gibbs in the UK. There was a tradition that was growing out of this. Mike Westbrook had done this beforehand. The big band. And two big bands emerged, and they were championed by the media. One was the Jazz Warriors, which had Courtney Pine in, and another was Loose Tubes, which was sort of fronted by Django Bates. Now, what was very interesting is that the Jazz Warriors seemed to come out of the tradition of the Jazz Messengers. It even had a name like that. Most of the musicians in it were black, and not everyone. My mate Sean Corby was in there on trumpet. And out of this became an educational aspect. Tomorrow's Warriors came out of this world. The Jazz Warriors were there. I remember watching them on, I think, the Tube. Mark Mondesir was on drum, playing alongside Art Blake. It was incredible. All these in Cleveland Watkins doing all his beboppy chatting. Steve Williamson. They're all incredible. They were the black big band. I'm not saying there was a jazz apartheid there. They might have had a couple of white people in there. But it was an interesting split. Maybe the times were more racist back then. But no one seemed to be doing anything about this. The Loose Tubes emerged with this album. I bought it when it came out. I was a huge fan of the Loose Tubes. Right? This was the white big band in the British jazz apartheid that emerged in the wake of Courtney Pine. This was the white band. You could see them all there. A lot of jolly hockey sticks going on there, you can see. Ian Bellamy, Steve Buckley, Tim Whitehead, Mike Lockhart, Dave Bitelli, Di Pritchard, Eddie Parker, Dave DeVries, John Eacott, Chris Batchelor, Lance Kelly, John Harborn, Stephen Day, Richard Pywell, Ashley Slater, Dave Powell, Django Bates, John Paracelli, Steve Berry, Nick France, Steve Arguelles, and on bass telephone type Rabbit and Rabbit, Colin Lazzarini. This became the sort of the white jazz elite, balancing out the black jazz elite. Now, you might say to me, why are you doing all this? These guys did play together. They did play together. It's interesting. It is interesting. But you've got to admit, that's a bit strange, isn't it, that there? It's a bit strange, I would say. Now, this album features Eden Express, Rowing Boat, Delineation Egg, Descarga. There's a lot of composition here for Django Bates. I was a Django Bates nuts. This was like an English Frank Zappa. His albums were incredible. I started to get all of them. I've got many of them. I taught his interval song, which was this beautiful tune which contained every single interval in the chromatic, scale, all of them. I used to teach by. I love Django Bates. I love Courtney Pine. And they did cross over. I'm just saying that there were these two worlds, these two separate worlds. And they formed the sort of jazz elite. Many of these people got signed up themselves. I've got a couple of albums here. Here's one, for example. Human Chain. Now, I loved all this stuff because it was tongue-in-cheek. It was very Zappa-esque, right? We got them playing all sorts of weird Django Bates compositions. We've also got on drums here, we've got, I believe, Stuart Hall on strings and piccolo, Django Bates on synthesizer, tenor horn, steel pan, and Steve Arguelles on drums, a great drummer. I love this stuff. It was funny, quirky, and I've got a lot of albums like this. I pulled this one out because it might have been forgotten. These albums I've got here were bought early on. And I think they've got forgotten in the long run. I think the Delightful Precipice albums are probably remembered a little bit more than stuff like this. But I'm trying to prove I was there. And I was into all this. I was going to see them live. I was a punter. I'd been rejected from it, but I still loved it. I have to say, when I pulled this out, there's another CD in here. I actually own a copy of Laundry Service by Shakira. Didn't know that. Just adding that into the mix. Right, so we have now looked at 3 albums. I've pulled out 2 compilation albums because it will get me the ability to read out a whole bunch of people that were part of this jazz scene. So this was I just played these to death. A Certain Kind of Freedom. Now, why did I buy this? Because it had 1 track on it by the Mondesi brothers. I can't see it now, but I know it's here. Where is it? This is when they were called MGM, and they do a track called In the Mold. Let's go through some of the characters on this. There's all sorts of stuff on here, and this is where you start to get a much more multiracial thing going, but not quite. All right, so who's on here? What names can we pull from here that are still relevant now? What are we going to discover? So the first track is by Mick Talbot, and it's called That Guy Called Pumpkin. Mick Talbot was the keyboard player in Star Council. Before that, he'd been in part of that sort of mod scene that the Jam were a part of. He's playing alongside Paul Francis on bass. He's got Steve White on drums, that went on to play for Paul Well and Star Council. The incredible Billy Jenkins. Billy Jenkins was like insane free jazz guitarist that was playing free jazz, he divested it through humour away from any sort of intellectual pretense. He was incredible. This is a bloke who would do an album of jazz standards. It turned out to be just him singing a cappella things like Food, Glorious of Food. He did an album of free jazz that was sound like being recorded in a boxing ring, and you heard the bell go, and then they come out and do some free jazz and then stop. Incredible bloke. He appeared on the they had a show broadcast from the 100 Club in London. I'm playing there in about 2 weeks, and I was thinking about that show because Billy Jenkins was on there. He did a version of Close to You by the Carpenters, and then when it came to Ian Ballamy's beautiful sax solo, he ate an apple, only to get cut short and then have to sing the Close to You lyrics, spitting apple all over the audience. Billy Jenkins totally out there. And we got Gary Wallace on percussion. Then we get a group called Backbone, and they do a track called To the Top. It's got Kevin Clark, who's rapping, Steve White's programming on there, Mick Talbot on organ. We've got Merlin Reese-Jones on guitar, don't know him. Alan Barnes, soprano sax, know him. But we've got the great Jason Rebello, one of the greatest keyboardists produced by this country, that went on to play with like Jeff Beck. And Dennis Rollins on trombone, great players. Then we have Sarah J. Morris, Steve White and Paul Card doing a tune called Certain Kind of Freedom, which also features Garrett Edwards on bass, Dave Newton on piano. And the reason I'm reading all these names out is if you go onto my Facebook and I start to put in what I'm a part of, being who I am now, I am very adjacent to all these characters. They're still around. They're all on Facebook. They all chat to me. There's a little community of them. Who else is on this that we might want to mention? Well, it's interesting because we get MGM, which has Mark Mondesi on drums, Michael Mondesi on bass, and the incredible Hawaii Gondry on guitar. Then we get the Paul Carr Quartet, and that features an American, Bob Berg on saxophone, but we've also got Lawrence Cocteau on bass. Then we get Phil Gould with his Road Less Travelled. Phil Gould, of course, the incredible drummer with Level 42, and he's pulled in a couple of British jazzers, including on guitar, the great Dominic Miller. Yes, friend of the channel, Dominic Miller. In less famous days, I imagine, because this album was made back in, when was it? 1990, a little bit late. I think this is 88, 89, a lot of this was made. We've got, right at the end, Gary Husband, and he's playing piano. Gary Husband was the drummer with Level 42, replaced Phil Gould. He was playing piano. So this was interesting for me because it was a fusion album. Now, I think a lot of these musicians that have grown up in fusion, the likes of Mark Mondesi, this sort of modal British jazz thing, this sort of jazz warriors thing that had emerged, this sort of loose tubes jazz warriors, crossover thing. It was the arbiters of it there was a lot of sort of tastmongers in here. There was a lot of elitism. A lot of the musicians who had the breadth, like a Mark Mondesir or a Mike Mondesir, to go and play with the Americans and go and play outside this, play stuff that was more fusiony, play with people like Jeff Beck or John McLaughlin, they sort of got removed. Because if you take the Courtney Pine group at this point in time in the 1980s, so important were they culturally that every member got an OBE. They all got, I think Courtney might even be a knight now, but I don't know. But they all got gongs off the Queen, except for Mark Mondesir. And I remember thinking this is puzzling because Mark is without doubt the greatest musician in that band. What, greater than Courtney? Well, yeah, because I've got ears and I'm going to say it now. In this modern world where everyone's going to play bebop vocabulary and everyone's going to play through those licks, you mentioned on how you can play the changes and can you get through giant steps. But back then I was aware that one of the things that was great about Courtney and made him different from Wynton Marsalis is that I knew he couldn't do that stuff. Now I'm the only person that's going to say this, and you're going to have to take this as a subjective comment from me. You won't hear it anywhere else. But my ears tell me that Courtney can't play through changes. He could do a solo version of Round Midnight. We hear it on that album, but that's what he did. So he really wanted to keep exploring this sort of reggae-influenced John Coltrane modal jazz approach. Because he ain't going to sit there and do the norm. I respected that. That was inspiring to me. I could hear it in the music. This is partly why I have the channel. Because if you approach music like an archaeologist and put your head in the speakers, you could tell stuff. Mark Mondesir wasn't your sort of jazz college educated drummer. He was doing something else. He was like me, but better. He'd grown up listening to Hard Rock and Billy Cobham, Steve Gadd, and he channeled that in a way that was really, really exciting. And so when he came to play like Elvin, which was a drummer that he knew inside out, so did I. He brought with it something else. Another drummer that was doing something very similar was Gary Husband in the Alan Holdsworth group. This was more interesting. In the beginning of the 90s, in fact in 92, another compilation came out. This was produced by Technics, alongside Blue Note, and was a showcase not only of the British jazz of the second generation of musicians and what they were doing, but also production. It's a fantastic album, even better than A Certain Kind of Freedom. So what's on here? Well, it opens up with Alfie Robinson. He does a version of You Haven't Done Nothing Yet. He's playing alongside Leroy Osborne on vocals, guitar and flute, Joe Brashon on piano keyboards. Alfie Robinson was playing bass, keyboards, vibes, marimba. He was primarily a vibes player. No drums on this, all program, but he also does some proper jazz with Alfie Robinson and his same lineup, but with Dudley Phillips on bass, Roland Sutherland on alto flute, Winston Clifford on drums, and Tunde Digigende on chorus stroke cello. This is really interesting stuff. It's exploring that sort of multicultural stuff that Don Cherry was doing, coming out of the back of Ornette Coleman. There was only one issue to me, and it was my bloody ears again. And what were my ears telling me? Well, I'll say it now. I'll say it. Alfie Robinson was not a player like Mark Mondesir. He was not a player like Courtney Pine. He was not a player like Django Bates. He happened to be in the right place at the right time, and he got a major deal, which he lost pretty quickly. This second generation weren't quite up to snuff. That's what I thought. Only on my personal opinion. They were okay. I saw them live. They were okay. But it wasn't taking my head off like the first generation. We've also got Django Bates with an expanded version of Human Chain, featuring Michael Mondesir on bass, Martin France on drums, Steve Buckley on saxophone. Incredible stuff. This was really allied to Bill Bruford's Earthworks. So at the time, it had a progressive rock type of flavour. Django Bates for me was such an incredible composer, real inspiration to me. Tony Remy was on this with a track called Booth, which was very, very fusiony, and it also featured on vocals Cleveland Watkins, who was like our British, what's his name? Don't worry, Be Happy was his name. Come on, he's really famous. He was like the British version of Don't Worry, Be Happy, right? And he'd got his major deal, right? We also had the drummer Frank Tonto doing a bit of programming on here. All good stuff. But again, Tony Remy, right? He wasn't John Schofield. He wasn't Al Di Meola. He wasn't Pat Metheny. He wasn't John Abercrombie. He was not Scott Henderson. This was quite obvious to my ears. He happened to be playing electric guitar and he was in the right place at the right time. The same with Cleveland Watkins. You know, he... oh, what the hell's that bloody bloke's name now? It's doing my head in. This isn't hooked up to the internet, is it? Anyway, it's one of my favourite musicians and absolute master musician. Bugger. I'm going to find out. You just hold your horses there, because I don't want to do any editing on this video. I'm just looking it up on his name. This is what happens when you get older. And those of you who are the same age as me will know what it's like to have, you know, something so obvious and not be able to remember the name bloody Bobby McFerrin. So Cleveland Watkins was like the British Bobby McFerrin, but to my ears, not that great, I'm afraid. This second generation of British jazz musicians, they embodied everything after the confidence that Courtney had brought in, because the British jazz scene has always been self-loathing, inferiority complex. Are we as good as the Americans? It's always been like that. And suddenly when we start to get the world stage, it's uncovered, no, we're not. We aren't that good. And this second wave of musicians sort of killed it in the way the first wave didn't. That is what it seemed like to me. There were some incredible players coming out there. I remember Jason Rebello, Nicky Yeo, incredible. A lot of these musicians were also coming across from big bands. Sylvan Richardson Jr. does a couple of compositions. He's playing bass on here. I believe he was playing guitar with Simply Red, a band I absolutely hate and really embodies the sort of aesthetic that just ruined the British jazz scene. This cod soul, no soul, limpid fusion, inability to really play. And this had existed. I mean, on this session with Sylvan Richardson, we have Mike Walker. Now, Mike Walker was one of the greatest guitarists I ever saw in my life. He was somewhere between John Schofield and Alan Holdsworth, an absolutely monumental player, right? But where was his deal? Where was his deal like Tony Remy? What was going on? We've got Tommy Smith on here, a great player, with Jason Rebello on keyboards, again Mike Walker on guitar. These guys are amazing. And then this album finishes up with the reason why I bought this, which was there's two tracks by the Mondesir brothers, the 10 Worlds and the Fantastic Four, which featured Mark Mondesir on drums, Michael Mondesir on bass, and the great Mo Nazam on guitar. I saw Mo a couple of times. He was flying like Al Di Meola, John McLaughlin. He had it all going on. I saw him. Right. This is where this video gets difficult for me as we get to the 30-minute point. When I started this channel, here I am championing jazz fusion, especially in the early days. And one day I'm walking into college. Back then, because I did drum lessons, my phone number was up on the YouTube. It's no longer there. You can't find it. And I get a message. I look at it. Love your channel. I've really been enjoying it. You mentioned me, and I was really proud that you mentioned me. Look down. Who's it from? Mark Mondesir. He's got in touch with me. I got in touch with him. He was doing a session up close to home. I came up and met him. I'm sat with an absolute idol. At some point, I was able to ring him up and say, I'm going to be doing a gig in London. He came to see me play. I did a drum solo in front of him. I was not worthy. And who did he bring with him? The great Mo Nazam. They were both sat in the audience. It was an incredible closing of the circle for me, because these musicians had inspired me, because I couldn't get to see my heroes up close. And they weren't a facsimile of it. They were doing their own thing. To this day, nobody, as far as I'm concerned, has taken odd time signatures, metric modulation, further out than Mark Mondesir. He's completely in control of this. His technique and fluidity around the kit is unmatched. He's so incredible. Absolutely incredible. And I absolutely love these players. This British jazz scene that emerged with Courtney Pine played such an important part in me as a musician, and it also played a part in me as a YouTuber. Mark Mondesir once rang me up and he said he'd gone to see the great Julian Joseph, and they'd been saying Andy's the keeper of the flame at the moment. I was very proud of that. But at some point, me, with my big mouth, I had to make a video called Why does all modern jazz sound the same? Why does it all sound the same? And this went viral. This is why you're watching me now. That took this channel up to another level. It was seen by a lot of people, around about 250,000 people, I think. It was responded to by very established jazz musicians. And for a while, every person that discovered me, whether it was Rick Beato or famous jazz musicians, discovered me on that video. I ticked a box and I struck a nerve. I think I've not mixed my metaphors right. I don't know anyway. But the point is, so I start to, as any good YouTuber does, I start to explore these areas. Right? If I've one thing I know, it's about the history of jazz. And that had enabled me to do the channel up till then. I decided to do a history of jazz. It was in 6 parts. And there I was saying what everyone says. You know, Congo Square, kept African music alive, influenced a whole bunch of musicians. The slave are free. Because of Congo Square, they invent jazz. Black musicians invent jazz in New Orleans. Buddy Bolden comes along, his first jazz musician, and there we have jazz. There we go. That's the truth. And I sort of said that, knowing that the whole time I've ever read this story, it never made sense to me. Congo Square's in like 1830 and jazz doesn't start till 1890. I doubt at that time. Why would they even know that what they were doing in Congo Square? There can't have been everything there, right? And also, Buddy Bolden wasn't the first jazz musician. There was actually jazz. So I start to research this more and more. And at the same time, there's this thing in America where Nicholas Payton is coming out saying, jazz should not be called jazz. It should be called black American music. Now, I understand the name jazz. It's not got a great lineage. It is a sort of way of boxing jazz, diminishing it and commercialising it, taking it away. And it's often been, you know, and this is the real reason why musicians don't like it. It's the kiss of death commercially to have that label on you. So they're always trying to escape it. I understand that. But the same could be said of the name heavy metal. The same could be said of the name bebop. It's all stupid. But they had to be in about it about that. But I did object to the idea of it being called black music. Now, I didn't object to it because of the history. I objected to it because I thought, well, the black community is selling themselves a bit short here, aren't they, in wanting to box off what they do under the name black. No white person would do this. You wouldn't have white European music. No one would say it like that. Because that music is everywhere. It's the whole world. You just diminish it. And you diminish the achievements of the actual black geniuses that did incredible things. The individual black geniuses. I started to do the research. I started to realise people like Sonny Rollins agreed with me. Some jazz musicians didn't. Some did. I realised Wynton Marsalis, who'd come out really championing this idea of the black classical music. Let's get the funding that's out there now, the conservative funding to fund black American music, And I could see these people who got the gigs and they got the funding, they were doing well. Whereas the fusion guys like Alan Alda, Scott Henderson were floundering. They couldn't, play the race card. I was working for arts organisations. They were playing the race card as well. I could see where the money was going. It wasn't going to poor black people or poor white people. It was going into the hands of well-off middle-class black people and people adjacent to them, all willing to play that game and say it like that. But more than that, I was pretty sure that if you looked into the history, there was nothing there to show that jazz was black American music. But there was something more interesting, because some of the people I was discussing with this that were on the other side and were very angry with me, that were calling me a racist, that a white middle class bloke, how can he talk about jazz? He just knows nothing about it. right? Whilst that was going on, I realised that these people that were saying that the Nicholas Paynes of the world, and I'm not saying he's got this opinion, but it was there, were really annoyed with British black people for saying that jazz was their music. No, it's not. You're not descended from slaves. Your ancestors didn't make the music. Your ancestors didn't invent it. You went from the West Indies to the United Kingdom with Windrush, and then you've appropriated jazz exactly like white people have. And I watched videos. Truth Saviour was the one that opened my eyes to this. I found it very interesting. If you believe the logic that jazz is black music, it's black American music. It's in the title. But black people in my country were talking as though they were in that club. My music. You can't talk about my music. And who was doing this online? When I looked and I saw the stuff that was going on, right? Who was doing it? The people I've been talking about here. This is the community that exists. Some people kept out of it. Some people didn't. Some people wanted to say I was a racist. Some people seemed to be okay with me. Then one day I'm sat there watching TV. This guy comes on. He's working for ACAS, but he's been sort of sidelined and put under investigation for being a racist. Why? Because he'd posted some Martin Luther King quotes, an article about, the underprivileged white kids in the UK, and some sort of neo-Marxist, black identitarians had decided to take him out. Let's destroy him. Let's get him to lose his job. He fought it. He went to court. Once it was up against someone with some brains and logic, it was thrown out and he won his case. And now all of us can have the opinion that the best way to see the world is in a colourblind way, that's not racist. The courts upheld it. And for me to want to treat jazz in that way is now upheld legally because of the incredible achievement of Sean Corby, who has now gone on to make what, from what I can hear, is one of the great British jazz albums. And he's coming out, and it's a mixed album. It's got white people on, black people on it. I'm playing on a couple of tracks. It's incredible. And Courtney's on it, and it goes back to that thing. It's got that vibe that I loved that was there. And Sean Corby was there because he was one of the few white guys playing in the Jazz Warriors. He was one of the few guys that was involved in Tomorrow's Warriors, in the educational aspects of it. But his input it did seem to be getting erased a little bit. Now, if we go back to this story I've just told, we also may have Itchy Fingers and Martin Speake. He did end up not only one of the great musicians, British jazz musicians to emerge, I think he's an absolute genius. Playing with people like Paul Motion, one of the few British jazz musicians able to, not just compete, but be equal, if not greater, than the international jazz musicians. And he ends up in a prestigious position at Laban teaching jazz. His experience of working with black and white musicians and all the things I've talked about, and these guys, being on the mainstream media nearly 40 years ago to be exact, the OBEs, all the stuff that this man achieved with what he did, the things that, like a kid like me would be sat, in some jazz club somewhere looking at Julian and Gary and looking at him and Mark and just marvelling at it, not seeing black people, seeing the best musicians I'd ever seen in my life. And that affected me. And so when Martin was asked, do you think that this, the British jazz scene is racist? He went, well, not particularly. And he wrote a big private email about it, which ended up with him being cancelled by the whole jazz community, by being demonised. And I saw this elite, not all of them, not everybody here. There were either a few people sided with Martin, a few people sided with Sean, right? And Sean's probably quite annoyed, and I don't give a toss because I come here and say what I think. Sean's quite annoyed that now with his new album up, I'm bringing this up, right? Maybe he is, maybe he isn't. He hasn't asked me to do this. Martin's not asked me to do this. No, what inspired this was this album. And I thought, my God, this is one of my favourite jazz albums. This was so important to me. How do I talk about it? Well, I'm talking about it now. Am I going to censor what I say? No. Am I going to censor my opinions? No. Am I going to say what I always do with everybody else and say some of these musicians don't sound that good to me, to my ears? Yeah, I am, because I always do that, and I'd be letting you down if I didn't do that. Does that mean they're not good? No, it means Andy Edwards doesn't think they're that good. It's not that big a deal. recently I've been pushing against this elitism that exists in the UK jazz scene. And this elitism is allied to identity politics, right? And you have some of the people here, and then people allied to them. This is the British jazz community. Now, when I've been involved in these arguments, and I've been called every name under the sun, and I've argued my case, I've argued my case. But when this has happened, I've been very aware that I don't need them anymore. I'm never going to be a part of the British jazz scene, and I don't want to be, because I've created my own environment here. But what's interesting, and this is what I wanted to report to you now, is that I've been getting a lot of emails from incredible musicians amongst the British jazz scene that agree with me. And they're tired of this sort of leftist elite that control it and control the funding and control everything. Your politics shouldn't matter. You can be a Nazi. I don't mind listening to a Nazi if they can bloody play, as long as they're not throwing their Nazism at me, right? Even if they do throw their Nazism at me, I hope I'm objective enough musically to go, yeah, but that's a bloody killer solo, right? And there's a certain person out there that will be horrified for me to say that. But I put the music above everything. That's who I am. I always have done. Music's my life. It's absolutely everything to me. And everything I've thought about it and everything I've experienced as a teacher and a musician, and I've played proper big gigs, bigger gigs than most of these British jazz musicians have had. I've played proper huge gigs. I've played on albums, and now I have this small but musically educated audience here. I don't need them anymore. I don't need to feel bitter about not getting that Svengali gig or getting kicked out of that, or the time I tried to bring Simon Phillips' incredible hard bop quintet over, only to be told that he's played with rock musicians and we're not interested in people like that by the British jazz elite. I can go on and on and on about this, right? The British jazz elite make me sick, right? And I don't need them. I don't need them. I can reach a bigger audience here in this room, inviting people up who want to play and want to get their stuff out there. And I'm getting contacted with people. Now, they don't want to go public on it. I don't blame them, because they've got to relate with other people. I'm on my own. The more I say what I think, the better this channel does. I'm very aware that I am not being racist. I'm not saying anything wrong as far as my ethical viewpoint is concerned. I'm not. Some of you might be deciding to unsubscribe for me because what I'm saying right now. Do it. Do it, you totalitarian fool, you. I can't take an opinion that's different to mine. My moral view is objective and absolute. If you challenge it, you must just be a bad person, and I won't have bad persons around me. So I will rid you. I will rid you from my life by pressing unsubscribe. And I don't care what your takes on jazz rock or prog or the fact that you inspired me to play. I don't care about that. The fact that you think that your moral position has the same value as mine when you are absolutely wrong deserves me to unsubscribe. And this used to hurt me when people used to do this, but now I do not care. I don't want you here. If you are that intolerant, right, you're the bigot, you're the racist, you're the intolerant one, right? Think about what I'm championing here, right? Am I colourblind? No. I noticed it when I was a bloody teenager. I noticed it. In the British jazz scene. What the hell's going on here? I noticed it. People tried to fight against it. People have tried to integrate. That's the true racism that's going on. That bloody jazz apartheid. The Garveyites that control the narrative within this. You know exactly who you are. Right? And why do they do that? I tell you why. Because they weren't that good in the first place. They couldn't let the music speak. Now, I've noticed that a lot of the musicians that come in to me privately and talking about this are actually more interesting. They err more to the side that Mark Mondesir went, of being interested in jazz rock fusion, more composed stuff, less modal stuff, all this stuff. I love the modal jazz, I love the free-flowing Coltrane. But Mark went his own way. He played with Jan Hammer, he played with Jeff Beck, he played with John McLaughlin. He played with Schofield. He played with bloody... I mean, Mark Montezia should be a national treasure. He should be a national treasure. For the last few years, he's suffered with illness. And he's kept going. He's got through it. I'm proud to know the man. I don't know what he's going to think of my take on this here. Right? I don't care, really. I love his playing. I love him. He's a massive inspiration to me. If he wants to think I'm whatever he wants to think, I don't care. Right? I come from my moral position. That's it. And I'm lucky because I now have this. And this YouTube, despite what certain people are saying at the moment on other broadcasts and elsewhere, right, despite certain musicians trying to make out that, you know, people like me are just sold our soul because we're just on about clickbait, right? I'm taking a risk saying what I'm saying here, but really I'm not. Because you may hate YouTube, you may hate the capitalist way it operates, right? But I keep you lot here because I talk about stuff that's interesting and I say stuff that's interesting. Do I think I'm objectively right? No. I might have said something wrong today. You might put up an argument against it. I will change my mind. I may even be an old fuddy-duddy middle-class white bloke who's bitter and has said a little bit of racist stuff that I didn't realise. And if I have, I apologise. Right? But what you've seen is what that sort of gatekeeping does to musicians. Yeah, I am bitter. You have picked it up over the years watching my videos. I am bitter. I'm a bitter musician. But it's not because I didn't have a hit record. I did everything I wanted to do. I played with massive artists. I toured the world. I played on albums. I got to do drum solos on albums. You know, I met all my heroes. No, it was amazing. What I've done in my musical life is amazing, and I'm proud of it. And I'm glad I didn't go down the jazz way. I'm glad I did it because I didn't want to just play to 20 people. You know, I didn't want to do that and worrying about what I said or what I did or what my opinions were and having to play the game and do all this crap, you know, just to get the funding because the money's not actually in. Because it's a non-bloody music community. It's a non-community. There's not enough money to support it anymore. The only people in there are the people who can financially support themselves. And you call yourself leftist? You're a bunch of bloody elitist, highly educated, supported people. You're the top of the tree. That's what jazz has become. I keep saying it over and over again. But there's a glimmer of hope for you that are calling me up and not a part of it. Because the jazz establishment will be hating what I'm saying now. They'll be hating it. But the truth is, I don't care about them. If you're an improvising musician and you feel that you have also been castigated out because you don't fit into this identity bloody world that you have to fit in to operate in it, and you're not, you know, your mommy and daddy's money backing you up, you know, and you haven't got bloody V-bop vocabulary because you couldn't afford to go to a proper jazz college. And if you had gone to the jazz college, you wouldn't have been in the top echelons. You would have been consigned to the back because they work on some weird hierarchy that, you know, only certain people get educated properly. Right, if you feel like that, I'm telling you now, look, I have created on the internet, you might think it's the worst thing in the world, but I can do whatever I want. If I want to come in here and make free jazz, music that nobody can get, I can. And when I put it up on here, people will watch it. They might hate it, they might love it, but they're looking at me. And why are they looking at me? Right? Because I'm spitting out stuff just for clickbait? If you think that, you're absolute idiot. If you really do not understand what's going on here. And I've got to be honest, I have to go on Facebook. You know, I network on it. It has to be there. But I am tired of having to see this going on all the time and see really great musicians suffering because they lack the courage, and I don't blame them, to step forward and go, no, I'm not going to play this game. Right? That's basically the British jazz scene. All right? That insecurity that was always there has manifested itself in a really weird, self-loathing, middle-class, educated sort of fake self-aggrandization to try and come up with what you really feel, which is that you are not really the real deal. Right? Because you know in jazz what the real deal are like. They're like people like Thelonious Monk and Charlie Mingus. Right? They never gave a toss what anyone thought. And I'm a musician, and I've studied and practiced. You know, I can play through giant steps on the guitar. Not well, but I can. She's more than some of the people I mentioned here. And, you know, I can play the drums pretty well. But really what's driven me all the time is the fact that I'm a contrarian. And I like to say, come out and say something which at least wakes a few people up. I may be wrong. I always say this. I may be just talking about the way I feel. It may just be my lived experience that you're hearing at the moment. But what makes me bitter is the treatment I've had by the British jazz scene, which was gatekeepers all the way through it. Right? I'm now in a position where I can go, and I just have. And I don't need that. But if you are a British jazz musician and you can play and you're doing something interesting, right? Whatever it is, even if it's just a blues guitarist that likes to play in a jazz sort of way, free-form, Grateful Dead, jam band, whatever it is. Because to me, jazz is a stupid name. Let's just call it what it is. Improvised music. If you're a purveyor of improvised music, this platform's here. If you want to come and play, I will showcase you. I'm hard to get hold of. I have a lot of messages. Sometimes it's hard to get back to people. Sometimes people are trying to push their album on me. I just don't read those. But if you say, Andy, I watched this video. I want to come over and play and improvise. Come over and do it. The platform's here. And let's rejoice the fact that I have at least carved out a little bit of space where you don't have to play their elitist game and agree with them. You cannot agree with them. Right? It's allowed. It's a free country. Thanks for watching this video. See you on the next one.